I'd like to start with your superb column entitled Losing Malmö and Brussels and Rome and Amsterdam. Tell us what you're getting at with those four capitals or prominent locations in Europe and what it might mean for us in the United States.
I appreciate the kind words. I think we're basing our national security problem on an easily knowable falsehood, which is that the only real problem to us is violent extremism, the enormous effort that's been made to try to bleach out any ideological catalyst for violent extremism, as if terrorism were just something that kind of spontaneously happens for no reason. In fact, the policymakers want to tell us that it's irrational and wanton. And I think we just need to cast our eyes over to what has happened in Europe and what is happening in Europe day by day to see that is just plainly a wrong way to look at the world. If you think about just Malmö, which is the third largest city in Sweden, it has not been the target of a terrorism siege, no bombings, no suicide hijackings, no assassinations, and the like. It's basically changing, becoming Islamized, having under circumstances where the government no longer exercises sovereignty over big swaths of its territory, and it's really been done without firing a shot.
Yeah. This is a function of what the Muslim Brotherhood calls civilization jihad, and you have documented it brilliantly, of course, in your various books and writings, a kind of stealthy takeover. To what extent is it now the case that these so-called no-go zones in Europe are effectively enclaves of Sharia in which we see sovereign control, as you've indicated, turned over as a kind of model for what we must expect if we persist in this kind of willful blindness, as you've called it, here in the United States?
Well, that's exactly right, Frank. I mean, what you're focusing on is exactly the point, which is that it is a model. This is not something that happened by happenstance. This is something that actually is a conscious plan. It's been called voluntary apartheid, but it has, in one way or another, been the instruction of very influential leaders, the most influential leaders in the Muslim world, whether it's the organization of the Islamic Conference, which really purports to act as the sovereign voice. It's the head of the governments of the different Islamic countries of the world, and it purports to act as the sovereign voice of the Ummah, the Muslim community in the world. So it's whether it's the OIC, whether it's a guy like Sheikh Qaradawi, who is the leading jurisprudent of the Muslim Brotherhood, who has counseled people, move to the West, integrate, but don't assimilate. Whether it's someone who is probably as influential a Muslim government leader in the world as there is, the Islamist leader of Turkey, Erdogan, who actually calls assimilation a crime against humanity and has warned the Germans not to try to assimilate their very heavy Turkish Muslim population in Germany. The message throughout to the Ummah is move into the West, move into these enclaves, insist on your right to govern life under Islamic law rather than the law of the state that you happen to be in. And the hope, of course, is that you get a multiplicity of these enclaves and that they spread, they ultimately join together, and over time, you really have a critical mass.
Yeah. And Andy, just to come back to the United States again, we've seen in recent weeks the White House directing the entire United States government that only the Department of Homeland Security can be the arbiter of who does training with respect to this so-called violent extremism. And I think you'd agree that the Department of Homeland Security has been deeply compromised by its outreach program with the Muslim Brotherhood. We have the president now enunciating a new strategy for partnering with local law enforcement and it seems Muslim Brotherhood front organizations. We have Hillary Clinton now promoting some sort of effort to accommodate the organization, the Islamic Conference, on its blasphemy laws by coming up with a formulation that will somehow deal with expression that has untoward consequences. Is this the sort of thing that you would find indicative of the sort of lead-in to the triumph, or at least the further progress of this civilization jihad in the United States as well?
Yeah, I think so, Frank. I think, I've often said to people who think it could never happen here, I tell them, look over in Europe where they used to say it can't happen here also, and it's happened rapidly. What I worry about in the United States is that it may happen more rapidly, because what they've done in Europe is something that you would think would be more difficult to do, which is really the physical seizure of territory and the intimidation of the police forces. We haven't had as much of that here, but what they've been very good at finding is, the weaknesses in the joints wherever they operate. And here, it's two things. It's the law, which can be infiltrated just by willful judges. And even more dangerous and perilous for us, I think, is that you have this huge bureaucracy. And I think the Brotherhood understands, because they understand power politics better than most people do. That's a real vulnerability, because you can get in there, and that's where policy gets made, and it's where policy gets implemented, and there's really no accounting for it. It basically foists a reality on people before they even know that there's an issue involved. And that's what's happening, I think, rapidly here.
Here in the United States. We're speaking, of course, with Andy McCarthy, our regular featured commentator on lawfare, the author of The Grand Jihad and Willful Blindness. Andy, let's turn, speaking of this kind of compromise and the effort to enforce on organizations subsidiary to the federal government this kind of willful blindness. The attack, I don't think that's the only way to describe it, mounted by the Associated Press last week against your old friend Ray Kelly, the commissioner of the New York Police Department, and his organization for what seems to be really an exemplary effort to try to counter this kind of effort on the part of the Islamists and actually monitor effectively what they're up to in the United States.
Yeah, I think we see everywhere an emphasis on outreach, which is the government's efforts to cultivate people in the Islamic community. And there is a sense in which outreach can be a successful strategy, but never on its own. It has to be coupled with the real reason that you do the outreach in the first place, which is that you're trying to get intelligence out of the places or about the places from which the threats may come from. And the purpose of doing the outreach is to try to cultivate sources in the Muslim community, not to be spies against the Muslim community, but to tell you where the threat actually comes from. And what the NYPD, I think, has been fabulously successful in doing is exactly what the Obama administration is telling everybody not to do, which is to couple outreach with efforts to gather intelligence within the Muslim community against the places, and unfortunately we know there are a variety of them, where they are basically preaching this ideology of supremacism. And, as we know, our friend David Yerushalmi and his partner, the Israeli academic Mordechai Kadir, is it? They did this mapping Sharia project where they find that in about 4 out of 5 mosques in the United States, you are getting an endorsement of violent jihadist literature. You're getting in over half of the mosques bringing in imams from outside who actually counsel and instruct and incite violence. New York is the number one terrorist target in the United States. We're the only target that's been hit a number of times now by the Islamists. That we remain a big target.
And we need the NYPD to be doing exactly what it's doing. Andy, we have to let
exactly
that.
Right.
Thank you very much, both for your efforts in countering this jihadism through your prosecutorial efforts as well as your writing. Keep up the great work, my friend, and we'll look forward to talking with you again next week.
Thank you, Frank.